Operation Mockingbird was a covert CIA program involving manipulation of domestic and foreign media. It began in the late 1942s, during a period when U.S. intelligence agencies were still defining their limits. The CIA quietly built relationships with journalists, editors, publishers, and broadcast executives. Some were paid, others cooperated out of patriotism, career incentive, or access. Articles were shaped, stories were buried, narratives were reinforced until they appeared organic. The program existed because information had become a battlefield. The Cold War required public consent, and consent required control. Officials believed adversarial propaganda could only be countered by influence that looked independent. The line between national security and public deception was treated as flexible. What went wrong was not a single decision, but the absence of one. There was no clear boundary that said this stops here. Domestic audiences were not excluded. Congressional oversight was minimal or non-existent. By the 1952s, major outlets had unknowingly or knowingly absorbed intelligence priorities into reporting. Facts were filtered long before reaching readers. The consequences surfaced decades later. In the 1972s, investigations revealed the scope of the program. Trust in media institutions fractured, not because journalists had lied loudly, but because the truth had been shaped quietly. The public learned that neutrality had been managed, not assumed. The cover-up was effective precisely because it did not look like one. It blended into the routine act of reading the news. Watergate scandal was a political espionage operation, followed by an attempted presidential cover-up. In 1972, operatives connected to President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters. The burglary itself was amateur. The response was not. Almost immediately, efforts began to contain the damage. Money was routed to silence those involved. Federal agencies were pressured to slow investigations. Conversations in the White House focused less on legality than on exposure. The motivation was control. Nixon and his inner circle believed political opposition was an existential threat. Surveillance and sabotage were treated as defensive tools. When the break-in failed, the same mindset applied to the aftermath. Admitting fault was considered more dangerous than compounding it. What went wrong was documentation. Tape recordings of Oval Office conversations captured the process in real time. They revealed a president calculating risk, delegating obstruction, and discussing the use of power to shield himself. The cover-up became traceable, audible, and undeniable. The consequences were systemic. Nixon resigned before impeachment. Dozens of officials were indicted or imprisoned. Public faith in executive authority eroded. The scandal did not reveal corruption as an anomaly. It revealed it as a process, incremental decisions made under pressure, justified internally, and concealed until exposure became unavoidable. The disturbance came not from the crime, but from how ordinary the concealment sounded when spoken aloud. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study was a U.S. government medical experiment that withheld treatment from black men. Beginning in 1932, the Public Health Service enrolled hundreds of poor black men in Alabama who were infected with syphilis. They were told they were receiving treatment for bad blood. In reality, the study was designed to observe the natural progression of the disease. Even after penicillin became the standard cure in the 1942s, treatment was deliberately withheld. The study existed because of institutional racism and scientific arrogance. Researchers believed the data was too valuable to stop. They assumed the subjects would not seek treatment elsewhere and did little to correct that assumption. Consent was never informed. Participation was maintained through meals, burial insurance, and routine checkups that disguised neglect as care. What went wrong was not ignorance of harm. Internal documents show awareness that men were suffering, going blind, becoming paralyzed, and dying. Wives were infected. Children were born with congenital syphilis. The decision to continue was repeated across decades by new officials who inherited the program and chose not to end it. The consequences emerged publicly in 1972. The study was shut down after press exposure, not internal correction. Lawsuits followed. New ethical standards were created, but the damage was already embedded. The cover-up reinforced distrust in medical institutions that persists generations later. The horror lies in the patience of the deception. It required no urgency, only endurance. The Iran-Contra affair. was a secret U.S. operation involving illegal arms sales and covert funding. In the mid-1982s, senior officials in the Reagan administration authorized the sale of weapons to Iran, despite an arms embargo. The proceeds were then diverted to fund Contra rebels in Nicaragua, circumventing explicit congressional bans. The operation was compartmentalized, deniable, and deliberately obscured through false records. The motivation was ideological. Officials believed stopping communism justified bypassing law. Congress was viewed as an obstacle, not a partner. Legal constraints were reframed as technicalities. The operation continued because it was perceived as morally correct by those running it, regardless of legality. What went wrong was exposure through inconsistency. A Lebanese magazine revealed the arms sales. Investigations uncovered shredded documents, altered memos, and testimony that contradicted itself. Responsibility was diffused. Key figures claimed memory failure. The structure of the operation made accountability difficult by design. The consequences were limited compared to the scope of the violation. Several officials were convicted, later pardoned. The administration avoided direct collapse. The public learned that parallel foreign policies could exist beneath the official one. The cover-up was not absolute, but it was sufficient. It demonstrated that secrecy, when layered correctly, does not need to succeed forever, only long enough. The My Lai massacre was the mass killing of Vietnamese civilians by U.S. soldiers during the Vietnam War. On the 16th of March, 1968, American troops entered the village of My Lai, expecting enemy fighters. They encountered unarmed civilians. Over several hours, soldiers killed hundreds of men, women, children, and infants. Some were shot at close range. Others were assaulted before being killed. There was no meaningful resistance. The operation was reported as a military success. The massacre occurred within a system that rewarded body counts and blurred civilian status. Soldiers had been conditioned to view villages as hostile by default. Orders were vague, pressure was constant, and accountability was distant. When violence began, it escalated without interruption. Few attempted to stop it. Fewer reported it honestly. What went wrong afterward was intentional silence. Initial reports omitted civilian deaths. Investigations were stalled or redirected. Witnesses were discouraged. Photographs and testimony remained buried for over a year. When the truth surfaced through journalists and whistleblowers, the military response focused on containment rather than transparency. The consequences were selective. Only one officer, Lieutenant William Calley, was convicted, and he served limited house arrest before release. The institution avoided broader responsibility. The cover-up revealed how easily mass violence could be reframed as procedure. The disturbance comes from how long the lie held, and how routine it sounded in official language. The Pentagon Papers were classified documents revealing systematic deception about the Vietnam War. Commissioned by the Department of Defense, the Pentagon Papers detailed decades of U.S. political and military decisions in Vietnam. They showed that successive administrations knowingly misled Congress and the public about war objectives, progress, and casualties. Internal assessments contradicted public statements repeatedly. The deception existed to preserve credibility. Leaders feared political fallout more than strategic failure. Withdrawal was seen as weakness. Escalation continued, despite internal acknowledgement that victory was unlikely. Each administration inherited the conflict and chose narrative control over honesty. What went wrong was exposure through conscience. In 1971, analyst Daniel Ellsberg leaked the documents to the press. The government attempted to block publication, citing national security. Courts ruled in favor of the newspapers. The documents were released in full view of the public. The consequences were indirect but lasting. Trust in government statements about war eroded sharply. The documents confirmed that secrecy had been used not to protect citizens, but to manage them. The cover-up was not about hiding a single crime. It was about maintaining a story that no longer matched reality, even internally. COINTELPRO was an FBI counterintelligence program targeting domestic political organizations. Initiated in 1956, COINTELPRO focused on groups the FBI labeled subversive, including civil rights organizations, anti-war activists, and political dissidents. Tactics included surveillance, infiltration, forged letters, false media leaks, and efforts to provoke internal conflict. The program operated without judicial oversight and was hidden behind national security classifications. The rationale: was prevention. The FBI believed certain movements posed a threat to social order. Legal processes were considered too slow or insufficient. Intelligence work merged with disruption. Leaders were monitored not for crimes, but for influence. Private lives were exploited to weaken public credibility. What went wrong was normalization. The program expanded quietly over years. Internal reviews did not halt it. Targets were rarely informed. Evidence was manufactured or distorted. When crimes resulted from provocations, responsibility was obscured. The program relied on secrecy to avoid legal challenge. The consequences came only after exposure. In 1971, activists broke into an FBI office and leaked documents to the press. Congressional investigations followed. COINTELPRO was officially terminated. Reforms were announced. But the damage had already been distributed across communities. The cover-up demonstrated how legality could be redefined internally until exposure forced a correction. The Bhopal disaster was a deadly industrial gas leak followed by corporate and governmental concealment. In December 1984, a pesticide plant in Bhopal, India, released toxic methyl isocyanate gas into surrounding neighborhoods. Thousands died within days. Hundreds of thousands were injured. Safety systems had been disabled to cut costs. Emergency response was minimal. Information about the gas composition was withheld from doctors. The disaster occurred because maintenance was deferred and oversight weakened. Warnings were ignored. The plant operated with known risks in a densely populated area. After the leak, company representatives minimized responsibility and contested casualty figures. What went wrong afterward was containment of liability. Investigations were delayed, evidence degraded. Legal proceedings stretched for decades. Compensation was limited and uneven. Many victims never received adequate medical care because exposure details remained classified or disputed. The consequences persist. Health effects continued generations later. Accountability was diluted across borders and jurisdictions. The cover-up did not erase the disaster. It reduced its official weight. The disturbance lies in how mass harm became administratively manageable through delay and distance.